We're talking, but we'll report on that later. Meetings with Putin. We were talking about that with Victor. He understands Putin and knows him very well.
What if the next global trade war shock did not start with tariffs, but with a political insult powerful enough to turn a strategic ally into a reluctant adversary? At the very moment Canada is sitting on what could be one of the largest lithium discoveries in North America, political tensions are rising fast. Lithium is not just another mineral. It is the foundation of electric vehicles, grid-scale energy storage, and industrial competitiveness in the global economy. Control over lithium is control over the future. Yet this discovery arrives as trust between Canada and the United States is under strain. Remarks attributed to Donald Trump, including the suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States, ignited outrage north of the border and sharpened public resistance to American pressure. In a trade war era, words carry economic consequences. This is no longer a story about geology. It is a story about leverage, sovereignty, and whether political arrogance can undermine the most valuable resource partnership on the continent. Cliffhanger, because the real danger is not what Canada can produce, but what the United States could lose. And the numbers behind that risk are far larger than most people realize. Stay to the end. The discovery itself did not happen slowly, and it did not follow the traditional rules of mineral exploration. In one of the most remote regions of northern Quebec, near James Bay, a breakthrough was announced that immediately caught the attention of mining executives, policymakers, and global trade analysts. An Australian-based company, Fleet Space Technologies, deployed a system that combined low-orbit satellites, ground-based seismic sensors, and artificial intelligence. Instead of drilling thousands of test holes and waiting years for confirmation, the system analyzed magnetic, gravitational, and seismic data simultaneously. Within less than 2 days, advanced algorithms produced a detailed map of what lies beneath the Canadian wilderness. The result was staggering. Preliminary models suggest the presence of hundreds of millions of tons of lithium-bearing ore, potentially making this one of the largest hard rock lithium deposits ever identified in North America. If confirmed through further geological testing, the scale would be sufficient to supply battery production for millions of electric vehicles over multiple decades. What makes this discovery especially significant is not only its size, but its location. Quebec sits on one of the cleanest power grids in the global economy, driven overwhelmingly by hydroelectric generation. This means lithium extracted and processed here could carry a far lower carbon footprint than material refined in coal-dependent regions. For Canada, this is not just a mining success. It is a strategic discovery that places the country at the center of the global economy's next phase, precisely when supply chains are being weaponized by trade war politics. But owning lithium is not the same as controlling its destiny. And once global demand enters the picture, powerful forces outside Canada begin shaping who truly benefits. In the next part, we examine why this discovery immediately triggered alarm bells across the global economy. The moment this discovery became public, it stopped being a Canadian issue. It entered the front lines of the global trade war. Lithium is no longer treated as a commodity, it is treated as a strategic asset. In the global economy, strategic assets attract pressure, leverage, and retaliation. This is especially true at a time when tariffs, export controls, and industrial policy are being openly used as weapons by major powers. Right now, the global lithium supply chain is heavily concentrated. Processing capacity, battery manufacturing, and downstream control are dominated by China, giving Beijing an outsized influence over pricing, access, and geopolitical leverage. For years, this dominance has been viewed in Washington as a strategic vulnerability rather than a market outcome. This is where the situation becomes dangerous. A massive lithium resource inside a stable Western country should reduce risk. Instead, it raises a new question. Who decides how this resource is used, priced, and integrated into the global economy? And in the era of trade war politics, discovery often triggers reaction, pressure to secure exclusive supply, pressure to reshape agreements, pressure to apply tariffs, incentives, or restrictions in the name of national security. Once these tools are activated, markets do not stabilize. They fragment. For Canada, this creates a narrow path. Any misstep risks becoming collateral damage in a confrontation between larger powers. For the United States, the stakes are just as high. Miscalculating this moment could weaken supply chains instead of securing them, driving prices higher for consumers and manufacturers alike. And here is the real shock. The greatest threat to this opportunity is not China, not technology, and not geology. It is political escalation between allies. In the next part, we examine how rhetoric and retaliation could turn this discovery into a strategic liability almost overnight. What happens when strategic resources collide with political ego? Behind closed doors, this discovery has already triggered uncomfortable conversations, not about cooperation, but about control. In an era where the global economy is increasingly driven by nationalism, even allies are no longer treated as neutral partners. They are treated as assets to be managed or pressured. Political rhetoric has consequences. Statements suggesting dominance, absorption, or subordination do not disappear after a news cycle. They linger in negotiations, investment decisions, and public opinion. In Canada, such rhetoric has fueled distrust, hardened public resistance, and revived fears of economic coercion rather than partnership. This is where the situation becomes volatile. Once public sentiment shifts, governments lose flexibility. Informal boycotts, regulatory delays, and strategic hesitation follow. Supply agreements stall. Investment capital pauses. What should have been a clean economic win turns into a political standoff. For the United States, this is a dangerous moment. Lithium is meant to reduce dependence and stabilize the global economy, but political miscalculation risks achieving the opposite. Fragmented supply chains, higher production costs, slower electric vehicle adoption, rising prices felt directly by American consumers, and for Canada, the pressure is existential. Yield too much, and sovereignty becomes a bargaining chip. Push back too hard, and access to the largest consumer market in the world is put at risk. Because once allies stop trusting each other, the next move is rarely cooperation, it is retaliation. And in the next part, we reveal how this standoff could quietly trigger price shocks, supply disruptions, and economic pain that reaches far beyond Canada and the United States. Imagine this scenario becoming reality. Lithium flows slow down, not because the ground runs dry, but because politics hardens, negotiations stall, strategic hesitation replaces coordination. What begins as diplomatic friction quietly spreads into the industrial bloodstream of the United States economy. The first impact would not be abstract, it would be immediate and measurable. Electric vehicle production lines would face supply uncertainty. Battery manufacturers would compete for limited material, driving input costs sharply higher. Those costs would not stay inside factories. They would move downstream straight into vehicle prices, energy storage systems, and consumer goods. As prices rise, demand slows. As demand slows, investment hesitates. Manufacturing job growth stalls. In regions that were promised a clean energy revival, layoffs quietly replace ribbon-cutting ceremonies. What was framed as an industrial renaissance begins to look like a broken promise. The damage would not stop there. Energy storage is central to grid stability. Delays in battery deployment increase vulnerability to outages and price volatility. Utilities pass higher costs to households. Inflation pressure reappears where policymakers least expect it, not from oil shocks, but from critical mineral disruption. Now imagine this unfolding during an election cycle, under the shadow of trade war rhetoric and strategic blame. Markets react poorly to uncertainty, capital pulls back, volatility spikes. Consumer confidence erodes. The global economy watches as the world's largest consumer market stumbles, not from scarcity, but from miscalculation. This is what makes the situation so dangerous. The United States does not lose because it lacks resources. It loses because political escalation turns opportunity into friction, because strategic allies stop acting like allies. And here is the most unsettling part. This damage would not arrive with a single announcement or crisis headline. It would arrive slowly, invisibly, quarter by quarter, until reversing it becomes nearly impossible. In the next part, we confront the final question: does Washington choose cooperation, or does it double down and gamble with the global economy itself? At this stage, the path forward is no longer technical, it is political. And the consequences of that choice will define the next chapter of the global economy. For the United States, there are only two realistic options left. The first option is cooperation. This path treats Canada not as leverage, not as a subordinate supplier, but as a strategic equal. Integrated North American supply chains are strengthened. Lithium extraction, refining, battery manufacturing, and recycling are aligned under shared standards and long-term guarantees. Dependence on distant, geopolitically sensitive suppliers is reduced. Price stability improves. Investment flows return with confidence. Consumers benefit from lower long-term costs and greater supply security. This path requires restraint. It requires discipline and rhetoric. It requires recognizing that in a trade war era, allies are force multipliers, not assets to be squeezed. Cooperation does not signal weakness. It signals strategic maturity. The second option is confrontation. This path is quieter, but far more dangerous. Political pressure replaces coordination. Informal retaliation replaces formal agreements. Regulatory friction slows projects. Tariffs and incentives are used as bargaining weapons rather than stabilizing tools. Under this scenario, Canada responds by diversifying away. European and Asian partners step in. Processing and battery investments are redirected. The United States finds itself competing for a resource that should have been naturally aligned with its own industrial base. Supply chains fragment, costs rise. Strategic dependence does not disappear, it simply shifts. This is how self-inflicted defeat happens in the modern global economy. Not through embargoes or blockades, but through arrogance, impatience, and the belief that leverage can replace trust. History is unforgiving on this point. When strategic resources emerge, the winners are not the loudest actors. They are the ones who lock in cooperation before politics poisons the well. Once trust collapses, rebuilding it takes years, sometimes decades. The danger is not hypothetical. If this moment is mishandled, the United States does not merely lose access to Canadian lithium, it loses credibility as a stable partner in the eyes of every resource-rich democracy watching closely. And when that happens, future discoveries elsewhere will quietly bypass Washington in favor of calmer, more predictable alliances. Because the most damaging outcome is not a trade war with rivals. It is a slow, strategic isolation created by allies who decide the risk of partnership has simply become too high. In the final part, we answer the question no policymaker wants to confront. Has the United States already crossed the point where this damage begins to compound? This story began as a breakthrough in the Canadian wilderness. It ends as a test of American judgment. The lithium beneath northern Quebec represents more than batteries or clean energy. It represents leverage in the global economy, resilience in supply chains, and stability in a trade war era defined by fragmentation. Handled correctly, it strengthens North America as a whole. Mishandled, it accelerates division and weakens the very foundations of economic leadership. The danger is not dramatic. There will be no single headline announcing failure, no sudden collapse. The risk is far more unsettling than that. It is a gradual erosion, higher prices that become normalized, delayed projects that quietly disappear, investment that chooses safer ground elsewhere. By the time the consequences are fully visible, reversing them may no longer be possible. This is why the choice matters now. Not next year, not after another election cycle. Strategic trust, once damaged, does not recover on demand. So the question facing Washington is simple but unforgiving. Is this a moment for restraint and partnership, or another gamble where political rhetoric overrides economic reality? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis where trade war dynamics, the global economy, and strategic power intersect.